Emily sat by the large window of her Manhattan penthouse, gazing at the city lights that sparkled like a constellation of tiny stars. A glass of red wine rested in her hand, its deep crimson hue reflecting the swirl of emotions brewing inside her. She hadn't taken a single sip. The loneliness had settled in long ago, an uninvited guest that refused to leave, weaving itself into the very fabric of her existence. Her husband, Mark, was away on yet another business trip, leaving behind a quiet, cavernous apartment filled only with echoes of what once was. She had grown accustomed to his absence, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. Their marriage hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, Mark had adored her, showering her with affection and attention. He made her feel cherished, as if she were the center of his universe. But as time passed, things began to shift. His work slowly consumed him, and she, once his priority, had become an afterthought. The passion that once defined them had dissipated, replaced by routine, empty conversations, and a growing emotional chasm. Nights like these, when the city lights twinkled through the vast window panes, only reminded her of everything she had lost. The sound of the front door opening pulled her from her thoughts. She turned, her heart fluttering unexpectedly. Ryan stepped inside, tall, composed, exuding an effortless confidence that was impossible to ignore. He met her gaze, a glint of something unreadable in his eyes. His presence always seemed to fill the room, as if the walls expanded to accommodate him. He moved toward her, exuding a quiet ease that made her chest tighten. "Dad called," he said, dropping onto the couch across from her. He stretched out as if he owned the space. "Said he'd be gone for another week." Emily scoffed, swirling the deep red wine in her glass. Of course he would. She had no right to feel disappointed anymore, but the weight of it still settled in her chest. Mark had once been so different, so attentive. Now, he seemed to exist in a world apart from her, a world she no longer belonged to. Ryan watched her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. He always puts work first. Emily let out a small laugh, hollow, bitter. "Yeah, he does." She shifted in her seat, suddenly aware of how close Ryan was. His presence filled the room. It was different from Mark's, more immediate, more pressing. There was an edge to him now that hadn't been there before, a sharpness in his gaze that made her catch her breath. The air between them thickened over the following days, each interaction carrying an undertone of something unspoken. She found herself paying more attention to the way she looked around him. At first, it wasn't conscious, but she couldn't deny how she adjusted her hair, how she lingered in the kitchen a little longer when he entered the room, how she found excuses to cross paths with him in the large apartment. He had a way of making her feel seen, something she hadn't felt in years. One evening, she found herself in the kitchen, baking for the first time in what felt like forever. The house was too silent, the weight of loneliness pressing down on her, and she needed a distraction. She mixed flour and sugar, lost in the familiar motions of kneading dough, until she heard the creak of the floor behind her. She turned to find Ryan standing close, closer than he should be. The heat from his body radiated toward her, making her pulse race. "You're quiet today," he said, his voice low. She forced a smile, focusing on the cutting board instead of his gaze. "Just tired." Ryan didn't move. He studied her, his eyes unreadable, but the intensity in his stare made her shift uncomfortably. "Dad really doesn't see you anymore, does he?" he murmured, a dangerous edge to his tone. "I do." Emily swallowed hard, choosing to ignore the implication in his words. She told herself that he was just being observant, that she was reading into things too much. But the way he watched her, the way he said those words, sent an undeniable shiver down her spine. Over the next few days, the tension only grew. Their conversations were laced with an unspoken understanding, one they both seemed to acknowledge but refused to address. It wasn't just her imagination. She caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't looking, his gaze lingering a second too long on the curve of her lips, the slope of her neck. One evening, desperate for a distraction, she decided to bake again. The smell of vanilla and cinnamon filled the kitchen, warm and inviting. She focused on kneading the dough, her hands pressing into the soft surface with deliberate force, trying to ground herself. But then, just like before, she sensed him behind her. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head without turning. "No." Ryan stepped closer, and she felt the warmth of his breath on her neck. "You don't have to pretend around me." Emily's hands stilled on the counter. Her heartbeat roared in her ears, drowning out the ticking of the wall clock. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I think you should get some rest, Ryan." "Do you?" he asked. His voice was closer now, laced with something dangerous, something that sent a shudder down her spine. She turned her head just enough to look at him. Their faces were inches apart. "Ryan." The moment stretched between them. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath shallow. She should walk away, but his gaze, dark and knowing, held her in place. Then, before she could process what was happening, he leaned in. It was brief, a whisper of contact that sent electricity surging through her veins. She knew this was a mistake, a terrible, irreversible mistake. But the moment he touched her, all logic dissolved. The next morning, Emily woke up alone. Ryan had disappeared, but his presence lingered, etched into the very walls of the penthouse. She sat on the edge of the bed, pressing her hands to her temples. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. A few days later, Mark returned. The moment he walked in, Emily knew something had changed. His demeanor was different, stiffer, more distant. She caught the way his eyes flickered over to Ryan before landing on her. Over dinner, Mark finally spoke. "Is there something you need to tell me?" Emily swallowed. "Mark, I already know," he interrupted, his voice calm, almost too calm. He pushed his plate away and stood up, walking to the window. "I was afraid of that." The weight of her choices settled heavily in her chest. The silence that followed was suffocating, filled with 1,000 unspoken words. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, to explain, to justify, but no words came. And in that moment, she understood. The city lights outside continued to glow, indifferent to the breaking of a marriage, as Emily sat in the wreckage of her choices, unable to take them back.